What if I told you that the most feared tyrant in English history began his life as a golden-haired prince, adored across Europe, a man so perfect in appearance and talent that chroniclers described him as the very image of chivalry? This is the story of Henry VIII, the king who transformed from Renaissance glory into a bloated, paranoid figure who ruled through fear and fire. And if you think you know how this transformation happened, stay with me. The truth is far more disturbing than the legend. Hit subscribe, because we are about to peel back the gilded facade and descend into the shadows of a reign built on pain obsession and the corruption of absolute power. In 1509, Henry ascended the English throne at just 18 years old, standing 6 feet 2, athletic and graceful, speaking 4 languages, fluently composing music, writing poetry, and dazzling foreign courts with his wit. His auburn hair caught the sunlight like spun gold. His complexion was fair and bright, and his charm seemed boundless. To diplomats, he was the very embodiment of the Renaissance, the sort of monarch who could lead England into a golden age of prosperity and peace. Yet, hidden behind this promise was a personality shaped by privilege and entitlement, and an early belief that his will was inseparable from divine authority. Fast forward nearly 4 decades, and the man who had once been the envy of Europe now weighed over 400 pounds. His legs oozed pus from infected ulcers that emitted a stench so overpowering that servants drew straws to decide who would dress him. His mobility was so limited that mechanical devices were required to move him between rooms. He slept with loaded crossbows beside his bed, driven by paranoia, to guard against threats both real and imagined. He had executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and left England's religious landscape shattered in ways that still echo today. The catalyst for his dramatic decline came on January 24, 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. Henry, still craving the glory of youth, charged into combat, but his horse stumbled and crashed down upon him. Witnesses recalled the sickening thud, the dust and screams, and the sight of the king lying motionless. For 2 hours he was unconscious, and in the 16th century such a coma was often a prelude to death. He awoke, but something fundamental had changed. Modern medical analysis, such as Dr. Armenstein's 2016 study, suggests that Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, likely to the frontal lobe, the region that regulates impulse control, empathy, and decision-making. Before the accident, Henry's executions were rare and generally followed legal process. Afterward, the pace of death quickened, the accusations grew flimsier, and his temper became a weapon in itself. Those close to him began to see flashes of cruelty that would soon define his reign. The accident also ruptured a varicose ulcer in his left leg, a lingering injury from a jousting mishap in 1527. The wound became infected, evolving into a chronic nightmare that never fully healed. Court records describe treatments that sound more like torture. The ulcers cauterized with red-hot irons, the searing smell of burning flesh mingling with the stench of infection. Visitors to the court would raise perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, some swearing they could smell the king's leg from several rooms away. This constant agony reshaped Henry's world. Once a tireless hunter and athlete, he now struggled to walk from chamber to chamber. Pain gnawed at his patience and clouded his judgment. His nights became restless, his moods unpredictable. Physicians and alchemists became his constant companions, offering hundreds of remedies ranging from ground pearls for melancholy to powdered unicorn horn and truth, narwhal tusk for protection against poison. His medicine chests, still preserved today, contained more than 300 concoctions, some useless, others dangerously toxic. Henry's obsession with his health spiraled into bizarre rituals. He appointed multiple food tasters not only to guard against poison, but because he believed certain foods could worsen his mysterious ailments. Mirrors were banished from his presence after 1540. He could not bear to see the bloated, ulcer-ridden figure he had become. Sleep came in erratic bursts, days without rest, followed by 18-hour stretches of unconsciousness. Courtiers learned to read the subtle signs of his gathering rages, avoiding his chambers when his eyes burned with that particular feverish light. As his body betrayed him, Henry's politics hardened into self-serving absolutism. The break with Rome in 1533, often portrayed as a theological revolution, was at its core a tantrum against being told no. Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and Henry responded by rewriting the very structure of English religion to suit his desire for a male heir. The great matter, as it was known, was not about reform, but convenience. He claimed divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow, though he had once sought papal permission for that very union. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, granting him a religious authority no English monarch had ever held. The move also unlocked vast financial rewards. The dissolution of monasteries from 1536 to 1541 transferred immense wealth and land to the crown, enriching Henry, while devastating communities that had depended on these institutions for centuries. What began as a personal marital dispute evolved into the largest property seizure in English history, and it would fund not stability, but the king's insatiable appetite for war and display. Henry had inherited one of the most stable treasuries in Europe from his father Henry VII, who had amassed over £1 million in gold and silver through cautious financial management. But within a decade the fortune was gone. The king's obsession with military glory led him into ruinous campaigns in France, costly sieges of towns with little strategic value, each one draining the treasury. The so-called Battle of the Spurs in 1513, which Henry celebrated as a triumph, was in truth a minor skirmish whose expenses dwarfed its gains. By 1526, desperation had driven Henry to debase England's coinage, cutting the silver content by a quarter. It brought temporary relief, but unleashed inflation that punished commoners far more than the wealthy. Over the years, the great debasement continued until the value of English currency had been slashed to less than half its original worth. The king, who had once been the people's golden prince, had become the architect of their economic misery. His spending was not confined to the battlefield. Hampton Court Palace alone consumed the equivalent of tens of millions in today's currency, lavishly furnished and staffed by an army of over 1,000 attendants. Henry's wardrobe expenses exceeded the annual income of entire counties. Doublets padded with horsehair to imitate muscle codpieces, reinforced with whalebone and stuffed with sawdust to suggest virility, every stitch a performance to hide the decay beneath. When traditional taxation proved insufficient, Henry invented new oppressive levies. The amicable grant of 1525 was anything but amicable, a forced tax that nearly sparked rebellion. The dissolution of the monasteries brought in a tidal wave of wealth, but Henry spent it faster than it arrived. By his death, England was effectively bankrupt, burdened with debts exceeding £4 million. As his physical form collapsed, Henry mastered the art of visual deception. The famous 1537 Holbein portrait, with its broad-legged stance and monumental presence, was pure propaganda. Holbein's use of forced perspective made the king appear taller and more imposing, the padded garments concealing his swelling body. The elaborate codpiece, a grotesque exaggeration meant to project masculine dominance to foreign envoys. Every aspect of the royal stage was carefully managed. The Great Hall at Hampton Court, with its hammer-beam roof and gold-threaded tapestries, was designed to draw the eye upward, lending the illusion of height and grandeur. His throne sat upon a raised platform so that even in his compromised state, he could look down upon all. In the flicker of torchlight, Henry's pale, swollen face seemed to glow, an effect engineered by the reflective cloth of gold draped behind him. Even his handwriting became a performance. As arthritis stiffened his fingers and pain made the act of writing a trial, he developed an oversized, flourishing signature, Henry R., that sprawled across entire lines of parchment. It was less a name than a visual proclamation the king's authority was still vast, even if his body betrayed him. The rhyme divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived reduces 6 women to footnotes in the saga of a monster. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years of marriage only to be cast aside, forbidden from seeing her daughter marry, and exiled to remote castles. She died alone in 1536, possibly from cancer, signing her last letter, Catherine the Queen, a final act of defiance. Anne Boleyn's fate was worse. Accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, she endured a sham trial and was forced to watch the executions of the accused before her own. The charges were so transparently false that even allies of the king were uneasy, but Henry's paranoia had reached a stage where dissent was itself a death sentence. Anne's fall in 1536 marked a turning point. The executioner's blade became a routine instrument of policy. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, gave him the male heir he craved but died 12 days later from postnatal infection. Henry mourned her publicly, calling her his true wife, yet within weeks he was seeking another marriage. Anne of Cleves escaped the axe by agreeing to an annulment, living out her days as the king's beloved sister. Catherine Howard, barely 19, was executed for alleged indiscretions from before her marriage, and Catherine Parr survived only by becoming more nurse than queen. Tending to the rotting volatile man, England still had to call its sovereign. Henry's execution record reads like a ledger of terror. Conservative estimates suggest more than 70,000 deaths during his reign, an average of 5 per day. The condemned ranged from political rivals and religious dissenters to ordinary citizens whose only crime was defying the king's will. His England became a place where words could kill you, and silence was no guarantee of safety. Sir Thomas More's execution in 1535 sent shockwaves through Europe. Once, Henry's friend and Lord Chancellor More refused to swear the oath recognizing him as supreme head of the church. His parting words, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," were both a farewell and a rebuke. In the cold logic of the Tudor court, loyalty to conscience was treason. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's break with Rome, and his most effective minister, met a similar fate. After the debacle of the Anne of Cleves marriage, Henry needed a scapegoat. Cromwell, who had dismantled centuries-old monastic institutions at the king's command, was arrested without warning, denied a trial, and executed within weeks. Service to Henry was no protection from his wrath. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 tested the king's duplicity. 40,000 Northern Catholics rose against the religious changes. Henry promised pardons and negotiations, luring the rebels into dispersing. Once the threat was diffused, he hunted down their leaders and executed them, his broken word staining the north with blood. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, age 67, became a victim of familial association. Her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, had criticized Henry from the safety of Italy. For that, she was dragged to the scaffold in 1541. The inexperienced headsman required multiple blows to kill her, a brutal end that horrified even hardened observers. In 1538, the Exeter conspiracy trials revealed Henry's paranoia at its peak. Noblemen were condemned for merely discussing what might happen if the king died without a male heir. The evidence was so thin that even members of his own council doubted its validity, but fear had supplanted justice entirely. By his final years, Henry's body had become a grotesque prison. Bloated beyond recognition, he required mechanical contraptions to be moved between chambers. The stench of his leg ulcers clung to the air, making audiences with the king an ordeal. Diplomats noted his labored breathing, the sweat that beaded on his brow even in winter, and the way he clutched the arms of his throne as though holding himself together by force of will. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died, leaving behind a kingdom bankrupt, religiously fractured, and ruled by his sickly 9-year-old son, Edward VI. But death did not grant him dignity. His corpse sealed in lead, and wood began to swell with the gases of decomposition during the funeral procession. At an overnight stop at Sion Abbey, the coffin burst. Witnesses described a sickening explosion, the stench overpowering the remains spilling onto the hearse. Dogs were reportedly seen licking at the mess, a final ghastly humiliation for the man who had styled himself as God's anointed on earth. It was a moment of macabre poetry, the body of a king reduced to carrion. When the vault at St. George's Chapel in Windsor was opened in 1813, investigators found structural damage to the coffin consistent with the old accounts. What some had dismissed as legend was confirmed even in death. Henry had been too swollen, too unstable to be contained. His reign, like his body, had been inflated beyond its limits, and when it finally gave way, the rupture was felt by all who came after. Henry's death was meant to secure the Tudor dynasty, but instead it exposed its fragility. His only son Edward VI was a frail boy who would not live beyond his teenage years. The king, who had torn England apart in search of a male heir, left the realm to a child too weak to rule, without regents ensuring the factional struggles he had once sought to crush would return with renewed force. Edward's reign was a brief and troubled one, consumed by power struggles among nobles and an accelerating shift toward Protestant reform. When he died at 15, the succession fell to Mary Lady Henry's eldest daughter with Catherine of Aragon, the same child he had once declared illegitimate to clear the path for Anne Boleyn. The irony was almost Shakespearean. Mary's reign became infamous for religious persecution, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Hundreds were burned at the stake for refusing to return to Catholicism. Henry's religious upheaval had sown the seeds for this violence. The pendulum swung back and the people suffered for the ambitions of a man long dead. After Mary came Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had executed. Her 45-year reign brought stability, prosperity, and cultural brilliance, proving that the daughters he had so often dismissed could rule with more skill and foresight than he ever had. Yet even Elizabeth's success could not erase the scars her father had left on England. Henry's legacy was not the strong, centralized monarchy he had envisioned, but a kingdom fractured by religious division, economically weakened and wary of its rulers. His life's trajectory from golden prince to monstrous tyrant became a cautionary tale whispered in courts across Europe that the corruption of absolute power can twist even the brightest promise into something unrecognizable. Modern medicine suggests that Henry's cruelty was not purely the product of malice. His traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and possible hormonal disorders would have altered his personality, lowering his impulse control and heightening aggression. Yet countless others have suffered similar conditions without ordering mass executions or reshaping a nation to suit their whims. What set Henry apart was the unique alchemy of power, ego, and pain. In his mind, his body was England. Its decay was a personal affront that had to be avenged. Those around him ceased to be people and became instruments to be used, discarded, or destroyed, depending on how they reflected his own sense of strength or weakness. Court life in Henry's later years was a dance on a knife's edge. Servants learned to interpret his smallest gestures, the tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the way his voice would drop just before he exploded into rage. Survival depended on anticipating his moods, offering flattery at the right moment, and disappearing entirely when danger loomed. Foreign ambassadors wrote in guarded tones about the king's condition, careful not to insult, but unable to hide their shock at his physical state. They described the odor in his chambers, the strained effort it took for him to rise from his throne, the way he would grip his sword as if daring anyone to comment on his frailty. And yet even as his world shrank to the dim rooms of his palaces, Henry remained a master of spectacle. He understood the theater of monarchy, the need to project an image of unassailable strength. Every public appearance was staged. Every portrait calculated a desperate illusion designed to convince England and perhaps himself that the Golden Prince had never truly fallen. Behind the scenes, however, the court was a place of whispers. The smell of ointments and rotting flesh clung to tapestries and clothing. Servants quietly traded information about the king's moods, knowing a misplaced word could send them to the tower. Even jesters, once free to poke fun, learned that humor in Henry's presence was a dangerous gamble. His obsession with medical cures reached absurd extremes. He demanded that rare ingredients be sourced from across Europe, ground emerald for heart ailments, bezoar stones to ward off poison, and human skull moss for epilepsy. Physicians competed for favor by offering increasingly elaborate and exotic treatments, their success measured not in healing, but in how well they fed the king's belief in his own uniqueness. The king's paranoia about poison extended to the very architecture of his palaces. Kitchens were reorganized to keep certain foods separate, and trusted tasters followed him from meal to meal. Some courtiers claimed he could detect imagined toxins simply by spitting food onto the floor if it felt wrong in his mouth. In his more lucid moments, Henry reflected on his legacy, dictating revisions to his will that shifted alliances and altered the line of succession. But these flashes of clarity were rare, and just as often he would undo his own decisions in fits of anger or suspicion. Counselors learned to delay carrying out orders until the king's mood stabilized, a dangerous balancing act in a court ruled by fear. Even foreign policy became a stage for his volatile temperament. Ambassadors from France and the Holy Roman Empire were alternately courted and insulted, depending on Henry's physical discomfort or perceived slights. Treaties could be promised over a banquet and threatened with annulment the next morning, leaving England's international standing in constant flux. The physical isolation brought by his illness also deepened his detachment from reality. Days could pass without public appearances, fueling rumors among the people. When he did emerge, it was in carefully choreographed displays, riding in a litter draped in gold cloth, or appearing at the window for a fleeting wave, the distance hiding the toll illness had taken. As the years dragged on, the gulf between the image of the king and the reality grew unbearable. In private, Henry raged at his reflection, or what little he allowed himself to see of it, cursing his leg wounds as if they were traitors plotting his downfall. Pain had become both his constant companion and the lens through which he viewed the entire world. Those who survived longest in his service learned that the surest path to safety was total submission. Disagreeing with him even gently could result in banishment or worse. The court became an echo chamber of affirmation where truth was twisted to suit the king's fragile ego and reality bent until it nearly broke. In the final months, Henry's world narrowed to a few chambers, heavy with the smell of incense and medicine. His breathing grew labored, his skin pale and waxy. Messengers tiptoed in with news, never certain whether the king would reward them with a nod or condemn them to the scaffold. Outside, the kingdom waited for a death that seemed both inevitable and unspoken. When it finally came, it was less a passing than a collapse. The machinery of state lurched forward, already shifting toward the reign of Edward VI. But the shadow of Henry VIII, the prince who had promised a golden age and delivered an age of fear, lingered in every law. He had twisted every fortune he had seized, and every life he had destroyed in the name of his own will. For the common people, Henry's reign was remembered not through portraits or treaties, but through the empty places at their tables, the churches stripped bare, and the taxes that drained their livelihoods. His policies had reached into the smallest villages, reshaping daily life in ways that would endure long after his death. The dissolution of the monasteries, once framed as a righteous reform, had, in reality, ripped the social fabric apart. Monks and nuns who had tended the sick and educated children were turned out into the streets. Lands that had been worked for centuries under the watch of the church were sold to courtiers, shifting power further into the hands of the wealthy elite. Those same lands often fell into neglect, their new owners more interested in profit than stewardship. Villages that had thrived under monastic protection found themselves abandoned, the poor, forced into vagrancy and crime, rising in the absence of the old community structures. Henry's religious revolution had not elevated his people, it had dispossessed them. Yet, in the official chronicles, these hardships were overshadowed by pageantry. Royal progresses through the countryside were staged to show the king's benevolence, even as the fields he passed were filled with tenant farmers, struggling to pay rents inflated by his own policies. The contrast between the image and the reality was as stark as the difference between the young Henry and the man he became. The psychological toll of living under such a ruler cannot be overstated. Ordinary subjects learned to weigh their words with the same care as courtiers, fearing that a complaint could be twisted into treason. In a land where the monarch's mood could alter the fate of thousands, uncertainty became a way of life. Henry's personal relationships reflected the same instability. Friendships forged over decades could be severed in a moment of suspicion. Loyal servants disappeared overnight, their names struck from records, their possessions seized. The fear was not only of execution, but of erasure, the obliteration of one's existence from the kingdom's memory. His surviving children carried the burden of his choices in ways both political and personal. Edward inherited a fragile throne and a country in religious flux. Mary bore the trauma of her mother's humiliation and her own bastardization. Elizabeth learned the art of survival from watching her stepmother's fates, shaping her into a ruler as cautious as she was formidable. Historians still debate whether Henry's later cruelty was inevitable or the result of his injuries and illnesses. The evidence suggests a man already inclined towards self-interest, whose worst traits were magnified by pain and the absolute authority of a king who could not be contradicted. Illness may have been the spark, but power was the fuel. The tragedy of Henry VIII lies in the gulf between what he could have been and what he became. In his youth, he had the intellect, charisma, and resources to be remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs. Instead, he is recalled for the severed heads of queens, the wreckage of religious unity, and the stench of his own decay. And yet perhaps that is why his story endures, not as a celebration, but as a warning. The Golden Prince who became a monster is a reminder that even the most dazzling promise can rot from within when pain, paranoia, and unchecked authority converge. It is the lesson of a reign where fear replaced loyalty and the crown itself became a cage. In the centuries after his death, Henry's image was reshaped countless times by propaganda, by legend, and by the shifting needs of England's rulers. Some portraits emphasize the virile warrior, others, the stern lawgiver. Rarely did they capture the reality, a man trapped in a body that betrayed him, wielding power like a weapon against those closest to him. Visitors to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where Henry lies buried, often remark on the quiet solemnity of the place. Few realize the vault had to be specially reinforced to contain his remains after the coffin rupture, a macabre echo of the chaos he left behind. Beneath the stone lies a monarch whose life and death were equally turbulent. The Tudors who followed him were left to rule over a realm fractured by his choices. Edward's regents struggled to keep the kingdom stable. Mary's reign swung the religious pendulum back to Catholicism, fueling more bloodshed. Elizabeth's success was hard-won, built on caution and political brilliance, but even she could not fully heal the divisions her father had created. In historical memory, Henry is often reduced to a caricature, the gluttonous tyrant with 6 wives. But this simplification hides the deeper truth. His reign was a case study in how personal flaws magnified by injury and disease can alter the fate of an entire nation. The story of Henry VIII is not just about one man's downfall. It is about the dangerous fusion of private pain and public power. Every detail of his later life, the fetid ulcers, the explosive temper, the grandiose self-image, speaks to a man at war with himself. That inner conflict spilled outward, consuming allies and enemies alike. England itself became an extension of Henry's body, subject to his whims, punished when he ached, reshaped when he demanded control. Even now, scholars examine the medical evidence, the court records, and the personal letters to piece together the puzzle of his transformation. The consensus is clear. The jousting accident of 1536 marked a turning point, but the seeds of tyranny were already there, waiting for the right conditions to grow. For the people of his time, however, no medical theory could soften the reality. They lived under a ruler who could elevate them with a word or condemn them to death with a glance. The unpredictability was as terrifying as the punishments themselves. In Henry's England, survival meant reading the king's moods like weather and hoping for a clear sky. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Henry's legacy is how quickly fear can become normalized. For decades, his subjects adapted to the shifting rules, the sudden executions, the dizzying reversals of policy. By the time of his death, many could scarcely imagine an England where the monarch's will was not law. And so, Henry VIII remains both a historical figure and a cautionary symbol. His reign shows how absolute power left unchecked does not simply corrupt, it consumes. It devours the ruler's humanity and leaves the governed in a state of constant anxiety, reshaping a nation's soul long after the crown has passed. The Golden Prince who could have led England into a true renaissance instead dragged it through decades of turmoil. His story is a reminder that behind every crown lies a human being, vulnerable to injury, fear, and vanity, and that when those vulnerabilities are armed with the authority of a throne, the result can be nothing short of monstrous.